Hey, this is Blake from the Gig Harbor Fly Shop, and for brand new fly tires, today I want to help you out by giving you the essential skills and techniques that you're going to need for fly tying. And we're not going to go over everything, this is not exhaustive, but I hope that this really helps you just as you're starting off and gets you pointed in the right direction and minimizes some frustration at the vise as you're learning. Okay, one of the things that I always try to do is I always try to keep my scissors in my hand at all times. And so there's a couple different ways I see people do this, but some people will actually hold the scissors like in their hands like this. I just loop it around my middle finger, and then I usually will make my cut, and I'll swing it behind my hand, and then I bring it underneath to make my cut. And so that's just the, just it minimize. I mean, this is the tool you use a lot. And so to keep this in your hand is great because I'll use this to like pick at something on a hook. I'll use it to hold thread, to hold material out of the way. I mean, it's more than just scissors. It's a really good tool that you're going to use all the time. And as you'll learn, fly tying material starts to cover your desk. And when you put these things down, when they're on the table, it's hard to pick them up. You have to like slide them off the table sometimes. And when you're using them so much, having to pick them up to make a cut is just it's just a waste of time. Now, maybe some of you're like, I picked up fly tying because I want to waste time. Then please put your scissors down. Relax. It'll be just fine. Okay, so scissors. The bobbin holds the thread, and one of the things that I like to do with the bobbin is I put the whole thing in my hand, and then this way I can kind of control the thread, and if the bobbin's a little bit loose and the thread comes off too easily, I can kind of keep it from getting too long on me, and we'll get into like thread length and all that kind of stuff as well in a minute, but those are essential tools. Some people will use a whip finisher to finish the fly off, and I'll show you how to use this in a bit, but I'll also show you how to do a whip finish without this, as well as show you another knot called the half hitch, and then we'll just go over some other things. But first, let's talk about the jaws. And so this is a Renzetti, and has a really great feature where you can actually rotate the jaws, and not only is this nice to be able to spin material onto the hook, but you can also I actually like it just to look at what the other side of the fly looks like that I can't see. And so sometimes I'll spin it I'll just grab the head with my hands, or I'll spin it with the spinner attachment. When you put there's a couple adjustments on here, so I'll just flip this over here. There's a thumb screw at the top, and then there's the lever bar at the bottom, the cam. So there's a lot of adjustment, and this is their top of the line vise, and so this particular one can handle the largest billfish flies. We're talking 6/0 type of monstrous hooks, and it will hold stuff all the way down to like the tiniest little 26s or 28s, stuff that I've never even tried to tie on before. And so to put the hook into the jaws, you're going to have to adjust it. So if the jaws are too loose, it's not going to want to hold the hook. And if the jaws are too tight, you're going to have to really crank down on this thing to get the hook in there. But the problem with that is that there's so much force that is applied at the end of these jaws that you can easily damage the hook, and then the hook will break. And sometimes on bronze hooks, you'll even see if you crank down on it really hard, you can see where it's pinched the hook, the metal, and actually flattened it. But so sometimes it takes a little bit of experimentation. You throw the hook into the jaws, and then if I can feel that if I'm really having to crank on, I'm like, oh my gosh, back off, that's too much. But you want to be able to just push down on it a little bit toward the eye and not have it slide down on you. So if it's a little bit too loose, and this, that's too loose. So you also want to, you don't want to grab, I don't want to press down hard and do this, but you don't want to grab the jaws. I'm not cranking down all the way here. I'm just holding this in place so you can see this. But I've seen some people do this where they don't put the hook in the jaws far enough, and this puts a lot of pressure on the tip of the jaws as well as the hook, and you can actually chip or crack the jaws on a vise doing that. And actually, true confessions, when I first started tying flies, this was probably about 20 years ago. No, this maybe longer than 20 years ago. I chipped the jaw on my vise, and it was because I wasn't putting the hook in the jaws correctly. So you also don't want to just bury the hook way deep into the jaws. That's going to get in the way, but it also does not hold the hook properly. So that kind of 45-degree angle at the bottom of the hook is where you're going to want it. Now you might have to change your angle of this depending on how you're tying the fly. If you have more of a rounded hook, a curved hook, and you're tying a tail that's a down-facing tail, you might have to put the hook in the jaws at a different angle. But if you have a rotary vise, like a Renzetti, you can always rotate stuff, and there's a lot of adjustments. So okay, so when you start the thread, one of the things that's really important about tying flies is to make sure that you have a thread base on the hook, because the material will stick to that thread and not rotate on you. If you just tie something right onto the metal's really slippery, and the materials are going to turn. So sometimes you'll see budget flies that are super cheap. When you see the 99-cent flies at like the big box store, the chances are like those were not tied by people that are using like the real way to tie flies. They're just putting material on and just trying to copy a fly, but they're not going through the actual steps. Now a lot of times people will start at the eye of the hook and they'll work their way back. And it's actually not necessary to do that, because you're going to end up laying a thread base as you go. But if you want to start just like where the hook point is, and so how you start the thread is I hold the thread and put it onto the hook, and I start wrapping, and I always wrap from me up and away and over. So I'm always going that direction. You don't want to change up directions, especially halfway through the fly, because then you're untying the fly, right? So you start towards the back of the hook, and you want to hold the thread slightly at an angle, and you're going to want to wrap back. So I want to wrap back over this thread. Sometimes people just start wrapping the thread on, and then it just unravels because they're not wrapping over the thread that they're laying down. And so I'm going to wrap the thread back. And when you okay, so here's the thing. You can either cut the thread, or if you take the thread and you pop it the opposite direction, you can pop it and break it. But since I'm always holding my scissors, I usually just cut it. If I'm tying with 8/0 thread, which is like the thinner thread that's more appropriate for trout flies, I'll almost always pop it. Right now I'm tying with 6/0 thread, so it's thicker than the 8/0, and this is a good general purpose thread diameter for streamers. It's good for saltwater stuff up until a point. If you're tying large flies, really large flies, you're going to want to step up to a heavier thread. And the 3/0 thread is really big. I like to, a lot of times I'll go to like a gel spun thread in like a 150 denier, or maybe even the 100 for larger stuff. So when you let the bobbin just hang, you're going to see this line of the thread where it hangs down. And as a rule of thumb, I mean, this isn't true on all hooks, but on most hooks, the bend where the hook is straight, the shaft, and where it starts to bend, usually the bend starts right above where the barb is. So I don't want to tie my tail. I don't want to tie it way back down the bend of the hook, because then I'm going to have like this angle of the tail. Now I might, if I'm tying like dry flies, or let's say if I'm tying an emerger pattern for trout, and it's on a curved hook and I want that tail to be hanging down in the water, then I'm definitely going to tie it down the bend. So if I'm tying dry flies, like especially mayflies, one of the things that I probably wouldn't be using this bright orange thread, but I thought it'd be more visible for all of you watching in. But you want to make a couple extra wraps of thread to create a little bit of a bump, so that your tail fibers that are hanging off of here for the mayfly, you want them to be so that they're straight or slightly angled up. That's preferred. You don't want them to be down. A lot of times when they're down, if your dry fly tails are down, a lot of times what that does is that it'll rotate the fly, and your fly will ride sideways on the surface. So sometimes you're like, why isn't my fly riding straight? A lot of times that has to do with the tail and how the tail was tied in. So 2 little bumps, it just keeps that tail angled up a little bit, and just gives it like what the profile really looks like, but then it just helps the fly fish better as well. So those couple different little bumps right there are great for dry fly tails. One of the things with tying is that we want to make our wraps consistent, and we want to have pretty steady pressure on there. A.K. Best was a really well-known production fly tyer, and he would talk about, he wanted to use like almost near the breaking strength of the thread. Now, you're going to break thread, and especially starting off, even experienced tyers break thread when they're not paying attention, or just because it just happens to everyone. And so if you break the thread, don't worry about it. One of the things to do, so I'm going to break my thread just to kind of illustrate. So if I'm tying a fly and I happen to break the thread, put your thumb on it real quick, because a lot of times you can keep the fly from unraveling. Now I'm assuming like maybe the fly's half tied or 3/4 tied. If I put my thumb on it, if my thread hasn't been, if it's still in the bobbin, so there, I pulled the thread through the bobbin a little bit. So usually you can grab that where that material broke off, and you can wrap over, get it started again. You can wrap on top of that piece that had broken off, and then you can just make your cut. That was my tag end. There's my. So so you can save a fly. So don't get discouraged if you break the thread. You can try to rescue it. Sometimes what you might have to do is you might have to take that long piece of thread that's kind of hanging off there, and you might have to just tie a half hitch knot, and I'll show you how to do one of those in hand in a little bit. So the thing that's going to break the thread the most is not the power and pressure that you're putting on the thread, but it's that hook point. That little sharp hook point, if you nick that thing with the thread, it's easy to fray the thread or break it. And so when you start getting back towards the back of the hook, you want to start to make more of an orbit wrap. And I like to keep a short amount of thread so I can control my pressure that I'm applying as I wrap. and just the thread is going right where I want it to go, and I can maintain the pressure. Sometimes, like, I know people starting off, the thread starts to get out of control, and then you have this huge, loop that you're doing here, and it's really hard to maintain the appropriate amount of pressure to lock that material in. But then you're hitting the base, you're hitting stuff, and then you end up getting slack into it, and then that just can be a disaster. So wind up that thread. If it gets a little bit long on you, it's okay. Like, wind it up. You can sometimes even just, like, I'll just take it in my hand and just kind of roll it up with my thumb. And so that's where I like to start for tails. So you'll see online, or even in books, you'll see recipes, and it'll list out the materials for to create the fly. And usually, if it's kind of done the traditional way, the materials will be listed in the order that they're tied in. And so it almost always starts with the hook on the recipe, and then it'll talk about, like, the bead or the eyes, because the bead is usually slid on the hook. It'll put the thread size in there, or the color, and then it usually starts with the tail, the body, the ribbing, the hackle, or the legs, or whatever the components are. And so you can actually look at I got a book right here. This is an old book from Randall Kaufman. So let's grab any example out of here. He's got some good stuff. Okay, so here's damselflies, and it starts with the hook, thread, and then wing case, eyes, the tail, the rib, the abdomen, the thorax, the legs. So he ties that first part in and then builds it backwards. And so it's in an order, if it's done the right way. Like these days online, people just put stuff up. So you never know. But like in books, like tying books, they're usually all listed out that way. So that can be helpful. Even if you don't have step-by-step instructions, you can still see just from the recipe how it goes. So okay, so a couple other things for materials. When you're tying in materials, you want to be able to tie the material in. So here's a little bit of rabbit. I'm just gonna pull a couple rabbit fibers off. I don't really have a particular fly pattern in mind here. I'm just demonstrating techniques. But you want to hold the material as close to those thread wraps as possible. So I'll lay the material on the hook so I can see, so I can gauge how long it's going to be. I can't cut this rabbit fur back. It'll look bad. So natural materials have a taper to those hairs and the fibers. And if you just chop them, ooh, I can't believe I did that. Look how horrible that looks. So if you just chop them, then it ruins it. So you have to position it on the hook for the right length. So, and this is the same thing for like dry fly wings and such. So I just can't even tie that on. I got to get another one. It's like when you hear a song that doesn't end on home on one, Okay, so here's some rabbit fibers. And then I'll transition my fingers and I'm pinching the materials on the side of the hook. And I'm not holding it way back here and trying to wrap this, because the material is going to want to move on me. So if I grab the materials and I hold it as close to where I'm wrapping, and I wrap just right where my fingers are holding, that's going to... So there's 3 thread wraps. They're pretty much right on top of each other, or pretty close to it. And this material is pretty well locked in there. So when you cut the rats off the end here, the little part that you're going to throw away. Now remember, a lot of the stuff as you're building the fly gets covered up and hidden, and so sometimes like those kind of components will help. Like sometimes you don't want to cut it short because you might want some of it to help bulk out part of the fly, but you also don't want the fly to get bulky when you don't want it to. So you can cut the material, you can cut it all different ways, but if you cut it at an angle instead of cutting it flat, then when you wrap it down with the thread, it'll kind of create a taper a little bit to it, which will keep it from getting a bump in the body. But if we're going to bury it, it doesn't really matter as much. So okay, so my tail's tied in. So now here, there's a lot of flies that at this point will have more than one material getting tied in. For example, if you're tying a woolly bugger, you're going to tie in chenille for the body. You're going to tie in you might tie in wire to reinforce the fly, and then you're going to tie in saddle hackle. So here I have a saddle hackle right here. So when you tie those materials in, the last material to get wrapped is usually the first material to get tied in. So you'll tie in. So for example, say I was only going to tie, I just stripped the feather fluff off the bottom here just to keep it clean, easy to work with. So just quick tip. So if I was going to just do the hackle and the chenille, I would tie in the hackle first, and I want to tie this in right on that little center part of the feather, and I'm tying it in at the tip of the feather. There's a couple different ways to tie in hackle that's going to be wrapped, and you could tie it in the back, tie it in the front, and there's different reasons why, but we don't want this video to hit the YouTube maximum of 10 hours, so we're just going to keep going. But I usually tie them in at the tips. So I would tie this in, and then it's just going to sit there. A lot of times vices will have a material clip. That's what this little guy is for, to hold things out of the way if necessary. My old vise didn't have the material clip, and it was still a Renzetti, so I would just loop it underneath the little cam. So then I would tie in my chenille, and then after tying in my chenille, I'd wrap my thread to the front. I'd wrap my chenille forward, and then this would get wrapped forward. So, and with these feathers, there's kind of like a natural curve to them that you'll notice. They'll have like a natural bend to them, and depending on the fly, you might want the curve of the feather going back on the fly, especially if it's a wet fly or a streamer, that kind of curved webby material. On a dry fly, you might want the feather tied the other direction, so it kind of slightly curves forward and stands up straight, because with the wet fly, we're looking for silhouette, the body, etc., and we're trying to and we're hoping that webby material has a lot of movement. With the dry fly, we want it. It's for function of standing on the surface tension of the water. So, so when we wrap this thing forward, we can kind of manipulate the feather. So my curve's kind of going back this way. So I can manipulate my feather, and I can push on the feather just to get it to kind of twist for me. And usually it's the first part is the hardest to get it started, and then once you get it going, then usually you're in the clear. But sometimes they'll grab those other hackle fibers, and then it'll twist on you. But use your thumb, use your fingers, press on that material. And then I'm just wrapping with a steady. It's kind of weird not wrapping over chenille because it's only on the hook shank here, but you want to have a steady pressure. If you let go, it's going to unwind on you. So you want to keep a steady pressure on that. So now when you tie off material, to be able to get that material to stay in place, you can hold the material slightly to the front of the fly, and then you're going to cross it with the thread, and then wrap up and over with the thread to be able to lock it in place. Now your bobbin's always going to hang down, and so when you cut material, if you cut the material underneath the hook, it's really easy to accidentally chop your thread, and then create some problems for you. So if you hold the material up, then it's really easy to go right down to the hook, cut the material, and then you have, you can tie that material off, clean it up. Man, that doesn't look very good. Okay, so but that's an easy way to make sure that you're not cutting your thread, is to cut on the top of the fly when that bobbin's hanging down. Some tools will have a half hitch tool in the back of the tool, and this is a Dr. Slick bodkin. And the idea is that you take your thread, you wrap around the back of the bodkin, and then you slide this off. And they make different sizes, so it slides, there's like 3 of them, so you can slide over the eye of the hook to make it a little bit easier. But that creates a half hitch knot. Usually what I do is I just put my finger on the thread, and then I will just make a loop, but I hit I use the shaft of the bobbin on the thread to open up my loop. So if I wanted to put my knot way back up in the fly, if that was needed, I can. But this just gives me the opportunity to, like, I'm going to tie my knot in a little bit deeper into the fly. So if I back it in there like that, then I can pull my bobbin down, and then I just keep it. I want to keep it on tension the whole way. I don't want to give it any slack because I don't want that thing to unwind on me. So again, I put my finger on the thread. The bobbin comes over to push on that loop, to open that loop up, because if I just wrap it around my finger, it's gonna, this just kind of is a pain to get it off my finger. So that opens it up, allows me to put that, so I'm using that bobbin to be able to move my loop wherever I want that thing to go, to put it in place. Okay, so when we're tying flies, it's really important that we don't tie too far forward and crowd the eye. If you're going to glue at the end, you don't want to get glue in the eye of the hook. You don't want to wrap over the eye of the hook, and the fly won't be fishable. So when you're building out your fly, you want to think about the proportions of the fly, and you want to plan ahead. And a lot of times with trout, we're kind of thinking of in the rules of thirds. And so we might have the tail, like in a nymph situation, the tail might be a third, the abdomen might be a third, the thorax might be a third. So you don't want your wing case and thorax to be half of the whole hook shank, or 2/3 of the hook shank. So look at the proportions of the fly that you're tying, so that you know where to segment your fly, where to stop, and all that kind of stuff. So here's the whip finish tool, and this guy, it rotates. So the idea is that you take the whip finisher, and here's the thread. I'm gonna hook it onto my thread from the bottom, and then the line goes over the top of the whip finisher, and then dropped it. Okay, so then I move my bobbin to the left, and it rotates the whip finisher upside down. And then when it rotates, what it does is that thread is going along the hook, and there's a loop that's wrapping over my thread. So now the loop wraps over the thread. I pop the back of the tool out, and then I pop it down. So demonstrate again. Hook underneath. Now you can I mean, here's another great whip finisher tool, and these are actually free, and you only need to use 2/5 of them, and God gave them to you. So you can just take your fingers, put 2 fingers on the thread like this. I'm going to rotate my thread over my fingers as my fingers twist, and then now it's just like my whip finisher. And I'll twist my fingers around to be able to create my loop, and then I'm just spinning around that line that is going right along the shank of the hook. Now, okay, you've seen me do several half hitches and multiple whip finishes. Not necessary when you're actually tying a fly. This is just for demonstration purposes. So just whip finish it one time, maybe twice. Hit it with a little bit of glue, 1/2 of a drop, but just to demonstrate. So take my fingers, hit them on the line. I wrap over because I want to bring my bobbin close to the fly, and then I rotate my fingers. So I rotate my fingers, and then I'm using that outside of the loop to wrap over that line off the bobbin. At this point, I can cut my thread. I meant to actually cut it flush, but that's okay. So, and then there's my demonstrated fly. It probably would still even catch a fish. So a couple of things. A lot of people want to fish barbless hooks, and so they want to pinch the barb down. Don't use your jaws to do that. I see some people use their jaws to crimp the hook. It just wears out your jaws. I mean, use a $5 pair of needle nose pliers or something like that to pinch that barb down before you throw it in there. I pinch the barb down after I tie the fly. I mean, it doesn't matter with the construction of the fly. It's just personal preference. But it's, I mean, you know, you want to, your vise, especially if you've invested in a nice vise, you know, like this one has a warranty. I could send it in, but then I'd be without my vise for a bit. So, so I hope that those little skills, tips, and tricks helped, and would love to hear some questions from you guys in the comments below. Make sure you subscribe, because if we have a bunch of questions that we can answer in another video, you want to get notified by if you're a subscriber. So thanks for checking out this video, and let us know how we can help you get into tying flies.